did you first hear about Image Comics? Like, what did you know about them kind of?
I knew very little about them. It was like, you know how it is. It's like most people, I think they're into comics in their teens. They go to college or whatever and kind of get out of it for a while.
Yeah, they're having to meet
and then come back into it again, right? The time when Jim and Rob and Mark and Todd were big at Marvel was the time I was out of comics.
So you were just...
I didn't even know who Mark Silvestri was when he, came by and offered me the work. You're
like, sure. I'm always into meeting.
Yeah, but I knew that Image was, the thing that was on the rise and all that kind of stuff. So.
But you knew about him to have Spun as a model at your booth.
Yeah, but I knew Spun because the guy I worked with, he was one of the producers on the Spun animated series. So there was that back stuff. Yeah.
That makes sense. And so from there, what was the did you pick up any material to read, to do any research on, to see what the characters were like, what color palettes were being used in the current books?
Well, that was the weird part about it, because the computer colors were not called computer colors back then. Computer colors were separators. We weren't even we almost didn't get credits. You couldn't sign anything. It's like everything crazy. Back then was done with guides. So you'd be handed a guide, a marker guide. It's like, okay, now do this on the computer on the page, right? And thank God for that, because frankly, I was always a good renderer. I never understood color when I first started there, and we had Joe Chiodo did all the guides, and Joe's a master painter, also did all the guides for the early Image books, or not all the Image books, but a good chunk of the ones that Steve Olef didn't do. And so I got to learn a huge amount from him in doing that, but eventually it became a point where anybody that I brought in then as my guys to staff up, I brought in people who could draw and paint. And then I was just teaching them the computer. So then it became very quickly that we didn't need guides anymore. Because we could do it.
You already know how?
Yeah.
So that kind of takes...
So I killed a whole, way of making a living.
It evolved. I think it wasn't even, I think it's just about progress. And I think you were definitely instrumental in taking things from that way and turning into the new way and the way of the future.
Yeah, well, it just seemed silly at a certain point, because it was like the first time they handed me one of the guides, the beautiful images. It was like I was looking at it, well, why don't we just scan these? Yeah. Why are we looking at them and recreating them on the computer? It's like, why don't we just scan these? Because they wanted to look back then, and the look was based on what Steve was doing at Ole Optics, which was, because back then you had to spend $10,000 to have a computer that was powerful enough to color a comic book.
Wow.
Right?
That's so expensive, especially back then.
Yeah, that's why there weren't a whole bunch of people coloring comic books. There was pretty much companies coloring comic books that had staffs of people. And there were two ways to go. One, spend a whole bunch of money on the hardware to do it, or spend a whole bunch of money on the software. And like Steve's unit used the Todd Barrett system, which is basically a vector-based system. So you could run a 286 could color a comic book. 286 is old school PC, right?
Yeah.
Could color a comic book because it's vectors. It's all structure drawings, not bitmaps anymore at that point. And as a result, you get these bands of color, and that's something that became a style and a look, even though you had to do it because it was that program. But we had to try and reproduce that in Photoshop when we didn't have to. And it was also something that I always struggled with, as being a guy who's been doing computers forever, back when it was like, okay, we got 16 colors to play with. We got 256 colors. Oh, we got 4,096 colors to play with. So it's like, we want smooth colors. Yeah. We had to do the banding thing way back when. It's like, this is old school.
We don't want to do this.
But it was the style. So we kind of did a kind of a version of that, I think.
That's cool to really see that it's funny that you see that kind of style stay around even after the technology's evolved past it, because I feel like the look is still there, and that's that people are used to it and they're familiar with it.
Yeah, the modern, there's a lot of people who kind of do what my style was at the end of the day, even today.
Yeah.
But it's a designed version of it. It's kind of like the idea was to reproduce old school, like George Petty or Alberto Vargas airbrush stuff.